Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm John MacArthur, and we're here today to talk about the Millennium Development Goals and the broader integrated challenges of approaches to poverty and extreme poverty. And today we're going to talk about the Millennium Development Goals really as a frame that the world has set for itself for tackling the challenges of extreme poverty and for really thinking through not just what those challenges are, but how they can be addressed and how the international community can organize itself to tackle the practical challenges. So today we're going to be going through a few sets of topics. One is, what are the Millennium Development Goals? Why are they important? Another is, what is the status of the goals? A third is, why are there shortfalls where there are shortfalls? A fourth is, what are the practical steps that can be taken? A fifth is, what will it cost? And a sixth is just a quick discussion of the critiques of the Millennium Development Goals. This is obviously a huge topic with a lot of dimensions, so we'll only be able to bounce across the surface of it, but just want to introduce for the global classroom, as we think about the integrated challenges of sustainable development, the world's integrated framework for tackling the most extreme poverty-related challenges of sustainable development, and want to try and flag some of the questions and topics that we'll be getting into in much more detail through the course of the semester. So where did the Millennium Development Goals come from? They come from what I call the Millennium Promise, which was made at the Millennium Summit in September of 2000, which at the time was the largest ever gathering of world leaders, more than 150 countries represented at the United Nations. And on the dawn of a new millennium, world leaders got together to say, after a time that had been pretty tumultuous internationally and had raised a lot of questions of who are the haves and have-nots and why are there so many disparities between the haves and have-nots. At this dawn of a new millennium, there was a very ambitious agenda set for human rights, for development, for security, and even for UN reform. And in the area of development, they made what I again call the Millennium Promise, which was they said, we will spare no effort to free our fellow men, women, and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty, to which more than 1 billion of them are currently subjected. Very lofty ambition to spare no effort. But very importantly, those world leaders, and you see Kofi Annan speaking at the Millennium Summit there on the left, and Kofi Annan was, of course, very much the shepherd of this process and the progenitor of an incredibly ambitious and galvanizing global movement that really rallied around these goals. And then you see on the right all the world leaders who signed on to the Millennium Promise. And I think it's important that we start from the fact that these are commitments made by world leaders. These are not random. These are not people here and there who came up with a neat idea. This is actually the commitments of the political leadership of the world to spare no effort to tackle these challenges of extreme poverty. There could be no more serious commitment-making body than those world leaders. But it's very important that they didn't just set this lofty ambition of sparing no effort, because there are, of course, many such verbal and loose commitments to doing more, trying harder, seeing how far we can get. Very importantly, they set a series of targets, time-bound practical targets, to tackle what is a pretty important and compelling cross-section of what it means to be stuck in extreme poverty. So there are 8 goals that are set, and originally 18 targets. And those targets each say, basically for 2015, how far should we get as a global community in tackling the challenges across access to education, access to basic health as measured by child mortality and maternal mortality, access to basic infrastructure like safe drinking water, access to education in equal measure for boys and girls, general stewardship of the environment, tackling hunger, and tackling income poverty. And it's really important that this cross-section was set because poverty is about so much more than income poverty. It's not just about whether you have $1 in your bank account or a shilling in your bank account or an extra unit of currency. It's much more about what you have access to in services, the strain that your person and your family is under, and if you are likely to die if you get bitten by a mosquito, or you have a huge risk of dying because you're bitten by a mosquito, that unto itself is an indicator of poverty, which might be affected by how much money you have, but the fact that you might be subject to a life and death moment due to a mosquito bite is unto itself a challenge of extreme poverty. So these goals were set, and crucially very targeted, and in general they were set with an ambition not to eliminate the problem in sparing no effort, but to at least cut the problem by half by 2015, and compared to a baseline of 1990. So in 25 years, from 1990 to 2015, let's at least cut the share of the world living under $1 a day or in extreme hunger and so forth by half. There were a few that weren't actual 50% targets, but child mortality, the ambition was to cut it by 2/3, maternal mortality by 3/4. But in general, the targets were brought together under a framework from various different communities around the world in public health and education and so forth, in infrastructure, to say, let's bring these goals together as an integrated set of goals, and let's tackle them together by 2015. So why are the goals important? Well, we've already talked about the fact that they are the world's shared development agenda. Many would say that this was just another political statement that we've heard come and go time and again. Why would we take this seriously? It might even be the case that all those world leaders, when they made the commitment, weren't taking it seriously, or they thought no one would take them seriously. But the reality is that they have become, due to their resonance, due to their practicality, due to their integrated nature, the basic reference point for how the world measures its progress and even orients its efforts to tackle the challenge of extreme poverty. In my view, the fact that they're quantified and time-bound and have a very explicit partnership agenda between the developed and developing countries, rather than a finger-pointing agenda, is a central element, if not the central set of elements that define why they're so powerful today and why they resonate, and why even in 2010, with 5 years to go, we see so much effort coming together around making sure the last 5 years are as successful as possible. I've included a quote here from Bill Gates, who is not generally known as a soft thinker on any topic, because he gave a speech at the United Nations, a special event in September of 2008, where he talked about why he thought the goals were so important. And as it says here, he says, they're the best idea for focusing the world on fighting global poverty that I've ever seen. With all these mountains of measures and studies and reports in the world, these Millennium Development Goals have broken through and grabbed broad attention. So he actually calls them the best idea for fighting global poverty that he's ever seen, because they force a report card, they force an objective measure of how we're doing, and again, they force an integrated assessment of how we're doing, rather than what one might call a cherry-picking assessment of how we're doing in a selected set of areas. So how are we doing 10 years after these goals were set? I'm going to run through just a few slides here, and you'll be able to look through them in more detail. But the general picture of the slides is similar across the board. This is a graph of the population living in extreme poverty, which is now measured, thanks to work of Xiaohua Chen and Martin Ravalian at the World Bank, as living on less than $1.25 per day. In shorthand, you could call it living on less than $1 a day. This is basically speaking the imputed value of what would be $1 if you were to monetize the things that people are producing and consuming in the poorest environments. So it's not even a real $1 a day, it's a value of $1 a day. And what you see here is that there's dramatic shifts in different parts of the world. The light blue lines show the 1990 baseline, And the dark blue lines show how the world was doing in 2005. The yellow band cutting across both lines shows what the target is. If you start at the bottom, actually, where it's light and dark in orange, you see that as a world, the developing world is actually almost achieving the goals already as a developing world. So the general population or percentage of the developing world that's living on at less than $1 a day was 46% in 1990, almost half the developing world. And today it's down to 27%, roughly a quarter of the developing world. That's very important to underscore because there has been extraordinary progress in tackling poverty around the world in the past generation. If you look at a breakdown region by region, you see that every part of the world, roughly speaking, with the exception of Western Asia, has had, and the former Commonwealth of Independent States in Asia, former Soviet economies, has had a decrease in extreme poverty, 1990 compared to 2005. What you see, of course, is that the levels at the starting point were quite different in different places. And you see that East Asia had a much higher level than almost everywhere except Africa in 1990. And you see that the rates of progress have differed tremendously across regions. And in general, the greatest concentration of extreme poverty still remains in Africa, while in general, East Asia and South Asia have had the most dramatic breakthroughs in extreme poverty. And that's why the world as a whole, aggregate numbers look so good. It's because ultimately Asia has been doing so well in economic development. If you look at a map, it tells you a slightly different picture. This is a global map of the same data, where a red shading shows that it's more than 50% of the population living in extreme poverty. Orange says it's 25 to 50%, and yellow means 10 to 25%. And you see there's some gray areas there where we don't have data, but in general, it gives a pretty clear picture of the geographic concentration of extreme poverty. And in most of sub-Saharan Africa, more than half of the population in each country is estimated to have, or to be living on less than $1.25 a day. And in India, which is a big country, of course, well over 1 billion people, it's down to between 25 to 50% in this coding, living on less than $1 a day. And China, of course, the world's most populous country, is even lower than that, less than a quarter of the population, approaching 10% living in that level. If you look at a weighting, and some of you might have seen this map before, of poverty based on where people live, this is what's often called a FAT map, where if you scope out the intensity of poverty based on where people live, you see that it's overwhelmingly in Asia. The greatest number of extremely poor people still live in Asia. And you see that in sub-Saharan Africa, there's still extreme poverty, but there are less people living there. So it's just a different way to represent the data. And again, as we get into this conversation, it'll always be important to think about how we represent data, both in thinking about poverty and, of course, in thinking about the integrated challenges of sustainable development across the board. So if you actually look at progress over time and look at the numbers of people living in extreme poverty, you actually see this story, not of the share, which has come down dramatically, but of the literal numbers of people. That's an important other angle to look at it through, because there are so many more people living in the world today than there were a generation ago. So in 1980, there was less than 5 billion people in the world. Today, we're approaching 7 billion people in the world. Very different weighting, and of course, the population growth is overwhelmingly in the poorest parts of the world. The developing world has the fast-growing population. The advanced economies have very slow growing, and in some places negative growth in their population. And if you look at this graph, I found it very interesting because you see the changing locus of extreme poverty over time. So in 1980, it's very clear here, if you look at the bottom dark gray bit and the kind of middle light gray bit, that's South Asia on the bottom and East Asian Pacific in the middle. The overwhelming amount of extreme poverty in 1981 was in Asia. And so if we were to have this conversation 30 years ago, there's no question we would have been focused on what's happening in Asia from a quantitative basis, because that was the overwhelming proportion of the world in that situation. Roughly only 1 in 10, so-called only 1 in 10 people in extreme poverty in the world at that time were living in sub-Saharan Africa. It's now down, and there's a line here marking 1990, which is the MDG reference date, but it's decreased, especially because China in East Asia has such dramatic progress. South Asia has had significant progress, but it's still had pretty fast-growing population. So the number of people in extreme poverty in South Asia hasn't changed so much. South Asia today has the largest number of people in extreme poverty of any part of the world, even though the share is going down. But sub-Saharan Africa is in many ways becoming the place where there has been a growing number of people in extreme poverty, even though the share of people in extreme poverty has been fairly consistent at roughly half, 40 to 50%, and depends on exactly which numbers you want to believe. What's interesting in that is that we're now at a state in the latest data reference point of 2005, where roughly 1 in 3 of the world's extremely poor people lives in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's gone from 1 in 10 to 1 in 3. On the current trajectories, probably in about 5 to 10 years, it'll be 1 in 2. So extreme poverty is becoming more and more of an issue in the 21st century about the challenges of Africa, whereas in the last part of the last century, on a quantitative basis, doesn't minimize the challenges that were in Africa at the time. It was much more as a proportionate issue about what was happening in Asia. And so we have to understand that for a couple reasons. One is what happened in Asia, what was different, what happened there that didn't happen in Africa. That's a topic we'll get into a lot over the coming weeks. But also, how do we make sure that we translate the lessons in an appropriate way? So if there's something that happened in Asia, how is that relevant if you wanted to replicate it in Africa? Or if Africans wanted to replicate it more appropriately based on what happened in Asia? What are the lessons? How would they be translated? How would they be adjusted? How would they not be appropriate, perhaps? And if someone talks about something that happened in 1985 in Asia, is that even necessarily relevant to something happening in sub-Saharan Africa in 2010 or 2015? That's the type of question we need to be asking ourselves. Very often the answer is yes, highly relevant. Very often it might be no, actually, it's different. And so we need to understand that poverty isn't the same thing everywhere. One of the great underlying issues of extreme poverty is, of course, economic growth. So as much as the Millennium Development Goals force us to think about issues of health, of education, of infrastructure, and so forth, we can't forget about the crucial issue of economic growth, because that is ultimately how countries grow out of poverty, is through economic development and growth. And this graph shows 2 bars for each region. The first bar is 1990 to 2000. The second bar is 2000 to 2008. So it's comparing, as best as we can so far, 2 decades. For 2008, of course, it's just the onset of the global economic crisis, so some of the numbers would be adjusted afterwards. But actually, most of the biggest changes in economic growth were in the richest countries, 2008, 2009, 2010. Although there was major consequence and major negative consequence, probably an extra 50 million and more people in the world pushed below the dollar-a-day poverty line because of the global economic crisis. The growth rates haven't been as dramatically affected in developing countries, especially the poorer ones. But that said, it's very interesting if you look at this graph. It shows you, again, another metric of how progress is happening in different parts of the world. In East Asia, and again, really driven by China, but not exclusively, this is gangbusters type progress, 7% growth and more. If an economy is growing at 7% per year, that means its national income per capita is doubling roughly every 10 years. It's very fast growth, the fastest sustained growth in history. Latin America and the Caribbean, you see its ongoing positive average growth, although much slower. less than 2%, which if you're growing at 2%, it means it takes 35 years to double your national income. And then you see Middle East and North Africa, actually an uptick in growth, but still slightly or much lower than East Asia. You see South Asia was doing quite well and has even accelerated its growth. And Sub-Saharan Africa is the one big change, actually going from negative to positive, where actually, if you had looked at this graph all the way back to 1980, there was almost no growth happening in Africa. And in most of Africa, it was actually called, the lost decade or decades of economic growth. In the decades since 2000, there's actually been a major uptick in economic growth in Africa, and not growing anywhere near what South Asia is so far, or East Asia, but it's actually really important to understand that since the Millennium Development Goals were set, there's been a major change in the direction of progress around Africa. So I won't get into the details of these slides because they're to be looked at on your own time, but we have in this PowerPoint some details on hunger, and you see here the general same story. Hunger is actually one of the issues where there's been less systematic progress around the world, but you see Sub-Saharan Africa is still the place with the greatest share of the population living in conditions of hunger, undernourished. South Asia is still extremely high without much fast progress, and East Asia has had tremendous progress. And on average, the world is making some progress, but not enough. Education has actually been an area of pretty significant overall progress, especially in primary enrollment. I'll let you look at that in more detail. Gender equality, again, significant enrollment advances, although still not all the way there. Child mortality is what I consider the ultimate bottom line metric of extreme poverty. Do you live or die? Does your child live or die? There's no more personal, poignant, powerful, meaningful representation of the value of a life and whether we care about poverty than whether we care about whether children live or die, in my view. And so just to understand these numbers, this is the number of children who don't make it to their 5th birthday out of every 1,000 live births. And it's got the data for 1990, 2000, and 2008. And you see that for Sub-Saharan Africa, in 1990, the rate was about 185 out of 1,000. So that basically means that almost 1 in 5 children didn't make it to their 5th birthday. Extraordinarily high rate of death among children. You see that in East Asia and the Pacific, it was approaching 50 already, which means roughly 1 in 20 didn't make it to their 5th birthday. Very big difference. But what you also see across the board is these significant improvements in child mortality. And actually the latest data suggests that we're down from about 12 million child deaths a year at the beginning of this period to around 8 million child deaths a year today, even with the growing population. There's been significant advances in child mortality, and people die for many reasons, and that's a topic we'll get into in the week on primary health this year. And there are many areas around pneumonia, diarrhea, which are leading causes of child death. Malaria is a significant cause of child death. Hunger is a dramatic underpinning factor across cases of child death. But child death is a kind of combined, integrated outcome metric on how people are doing. Maternal mortality, I stress here, because this is an area that's actually been receiving significant attention lately for 2 reasons. One is that it is generally understood to be the most overlooked of the Millennium Development Goals in the first 10 years. So it's an example of where the Millennium Development Goals have been extremely helpful, because this 5th goal, so-called MDG 5, people have said, wait a second, we're not doing very well on MDG 5, and it's actually helped shine a spotlight on this issue where the world has been generally quite delinquent. There are probably multiple reasons why this goal is not done so well. Part of it is bias in the world. Men aren't maybe so thoughtful about the needs of women giving birth prenatal care, postnatal care. It's probably a serious form of gender discrimination with a lot of life and death consequences. There is certainly an aspect of which maternal care, especially things like emergency obstetrical care, require a little bit of health systems. So it's more complicated than an immunization or a bed net. It means an ambulance, or it means a C-section for a mother in breech. These are a little more technically involved, although not terribly. And it's an area that has now got huge, I would say, political momentum. And hopefully we'll see a breakthrough in the next year or so in terms of the global effort to tackle the health system interventions that are required to get maternal mortality down dramatically. Now, all of that said, Chris Murray, who's a leading health specialist based at the University of Washington, has recently published with his team a paper in The Lancet, which says we actually might be doing much better than these data suggest in tackling maternal mortality. So we'll put that article online so everyone can read it to see how the data compare. But he suggests, and his team suggests, that we actually might be making much more progress than we thought. Doesn't mean it's not an issue, but much more progress if we look at the data in a different way. And that's caused quite a bit of public discussion in the past few months since that paper came out. Water, and this is just a picture of an improved water source. Water is a little bit tricky to measure, and there are a lot of technical issues, and we'll get into that in the course too, around how do you measure good water versus bad water. We talk about improved water sources and improved drinking sources, where you have a source of delivery point that ensures protection from contamination, especially from fecal matter. There are a lot of different ways to deliver that. And again, you see this pattern of general progress across the board, but sub-Saharan Africa not doing nearly as well on a rate of progress basis, or on a level basis, and Middle East and North Africa not making much progress, but East Asian Pacific actually already having achieved that goal. So why are there shortfalls? There are many areas of progress, and there are many areas where there are shortfalls. We're going to talk about this a lot in the course of this semester, how to understand general gaps and metrics of progress. I think the one major point I would want to stress right now is that most of the reasons that we're given for why there are shortfalls are typically far too superficial for understanding why there are shortfalls. So the number one reason that we tend to hear in the media and even in policy discussions is there are bad governments. And in places where there's bad governance or corruption, things don't work, and therefore, what can you do when there's bad governance? There's no question that bad governance matters, and we need to be very explicit about that. And if you have a terrible government, it can be impossible to do anything if the government is really committed to making sure nothing happens, or for whatever reason doesn't want anything to happen. However, there are many, many cases where countries that were accused of terrible governance have done incredible things because they focus on very practical issues. And there are also many instances where two countries with the same technical ratings of governance are doing very differently. Some are growing fast economically, some aren't growing at all, some are making major progress on child mortality, some are making none at all. Some are doing dramatic expansion of infrastructure, some doing none at all. And as much as we have to really be honest and direct about the realities of governance, we have to unpack that significantly to understand what it means. And the way I like to think about it is governance for what? Governance for democracy, governance for health service delivery, governance for immunizations, governance for community empowerment. There are many, many different subtopics within that. And so without getting into all of it right now, I want to flag that there are many different types of issues, and there are even reasons why some places probably have more strained governments. And so if we identify a few key reasons why places aren't doing as well on some areas or on all areas, governance failures is real. But there are also sometimes just areas of policy neglect, like maternal mortality. Government might be doing great things, but just hasn't paid attention to this issue and forgets it, or doesn't care, or doesn't pay attention, or doesn't get serious, or doesn't put a budget to it. There are other areas, and you see it in countries like in Brazil and Latin America or in India, where you have really huge variation in geography and in society, where some parts of the country are doing extremely well and some parts of the country are just being left behind. And so the averages might mask a much richer story. You have some places where it's certain ethnic groups that are being left out, or certain classes that might be left out, who also happen to be ethnic groups, or there are many different reasons why people can be included and excluded. It might be because of where they live, or it might be because of who they are. And those forms of exclusion or discrimination can tell a layered and segmented story within overall trends. And then you can also have poverty traps. And this is a point that we've really emphasized in our own work in the past several years, is how some countries just get stuck in extreme poverty. And there are many types of reasons why that can happen. And there is some academic debate on the conditions under which that can happen. But the general point is that some places are just so poor, and the challenges that they're facing are just so great that they're not able, because of their poverty, to make the basic investments required to overcome those challenges. So just to give a few illustrative examples. This is a graph of the probability of conflict and civil conflict, which you can consider one type of governance failure. The government breaks down into war. It's a serious form, where the society breaks down into war. And this is the risk of conflict within 5 years at different levels of income per capita. So this is done by leading political scientists, Fearon and Layton. And it's published several years ago. It shows that there's, in their estimates, hyperbola there basically of an asymptotic relationship between the risk of conflict at extreme poverty and level of income per capita. And you see that the level of risk at $1,000 per capita is dramatically lower than it is at $500 per capita or even $300 per capita. Since this was published, there's much more evidence that's come out on, for example, the risk of conflict in low-income countries when the temperature is higher or when the rains fail. And basically, in Africa in particular, there's a lot of strong evidence in the leading journals that shows that when the rains fail or the temperature is really high, there's a bit of debate over which one matters more, the crops fail and there's a negative economic shock, and then basically hungry people with less income and less food are more likely to fight. And so you have a chain of causality from nature to hunger and starvation to conflict. And wealthier societies have a much lower risk of those activities having that consequence. So it's one example of where poverty can lead to what's often called a poverty conflict trap, as one form of trap. I mentioned drought. This is a map that was made by our colleagues at CIESN at Columbia University on the human risk of mortality based on drought. And what this graph shows is if it's in red, it's in the top few deciles of risk. If it's in yellow, it's the middle deciles, and blue is the lowest deciles. And what that means is the places where people are most likely to die due to drought are in red. The places where they're next most likely to die due to drought are in yellow, and then blue. And you see that Africa actually has a huge risk of mortality just due to drought. It's nothing to do with anything else necessarily beyond drought. This is another map of the ecological factors conducive to malaria. Malaria is a great example of a topic that we'll be discussing more in this course. Often people say, well, we had malaria in the United States and we got rid of it. Why can't they get rid of malaria there? Or there was malaria in the Panama Canal and they finally solved that problem. Why can't malaria be solved there? The reality is that malaria, as one disease, actually has many forms. There's falciparum malaria, for example, which is the type of parasite that kills you. There's vivax malaria, which is the type that makes you sick. There are different types of mosquitoes that cover or carry different types of malaria parasite. And those mosquitoes, some of them in India, for example, prefer to bite cattle. Some of them in Africa, for example, prefer to bite humans. And even the temperature that determines the reproductive rate of the parasite in the belly of the mosquito is a determining variable on whether you have year-round transmission or seasonal transmission of malaria. Because ultimately, if the mosquito dies before the parasite reproduces, then you can break the transmission. If the parasite reproduces and goes back through the mother mosquito's saliva into the bloodstream before the mosquito dies, you complete the cycle of transmission. That's an ecologically determined factor. And this map shows the ecological determinants of malaria transmission, and you see just how concentrated this is in certain parts of the world where darker basically means much more conducive to transmission. And this has nothing to do ultimately with human institutions. This is ecology, and it's a classic reason why we need to understand ecology and disease control if we want to understand child mortality and human outcomes in these places. So what are practical steps that can be taken? We have a storyline here of tremendous progress in some places, some progress, but often not so much progress in other places, some issues, like maternal mortality, that aren't getting much progress across most places. How do we understand how to translate that into practicality? And that's really a core point of this course, if not the core point of this course, is how do we solve these problems? And when I mean we as the global community, I mean we as students, we as practitioners, we as policymakers, we as academics. And we have to distill, I think, a diagnosis of why something is happening and say, what would it take to tackle that practical challenge? And then what would it take to organize ourselves to tackle that practical challenge? And so these are a few examples to illustrate. So low food yield, for example, in Africa. Africa is the only part of the world that has not yet had what's called a green revolution in shorthand. Generally speaking, a green revolution means jumping from 1 ton per hectare of food production to 2 to 3 tons per hectare of food production. Much of Southeast Asia went through this in the middle of the 20th century. Korea and Taiwan went through it in the 1920s and 30s. Japan went through it in the course of the Meiji Restoration. China went through it really in the 1960s. Indonesia in the late 60s and 70s. India and Pakistan in the late 60s and 70s. And then on into the 80s. Africa has never gone through this. And ultimately, there are a lot of very practical reasons why Africa has not had a boost in food production. And that's a huge issue, not just for hunger, but for actually economic growth in a place where most of the people are still farmers. And what they do for a living is grow food to eat among their family. This is a picture taken in Western Kenya of, on the left, you have modern variety maize, corn, properly fertilized, and on the right, you have an old variety of maize, unfertilized. It's taken from the same farm. And it just shows you how practical the difference is on the same farm of good versus bad outcomes. And that's basically what economic growth looks like to a farmer in Western Kenya, is growing bigger and better maize. Very practical issue, and we're going to talk a lot about that issue and others on what it actually takes to enable that to happen. Malaria, 10 years ago, no one even talked about malaria globally. It's now thankfully become, I mean that at a serious public level. It was obviously a professional question for malariologists. But now we have a major public global effort around malaria. And really what it means is, on the left you have a classic example, in the best case of a child getting treated for malaria. But typically at the beginning of this decade you had 1 million children and more dying of malaria. Most of them in Africa, most of them under 5 years old. And it's a disease from which literally no one needs to die. It's totally 100% treatable, even where it's not preventable, and it's hugely preventable, actually. So a bed net, a long-lasting insecticide-treated net, which is a relatively new technology, where the insecticide is in the weave of the net, pioneered by Sumitomo Chemical, Japanese company, has actually created a very low-cost technology. It costs roughly $10, lasts for 5 years. 2 people can sleep under it. And it results in huge declines in transmission of malaria, often 30 to 50% in transmission. There are other acronyms at the bottom there, which we'll get to know soon. The bed nets are known as LLINs, long-lasting insecticide-treated nets. ACT is artemisinin combination therapy. That's what you take when you get malaria, based on Artemisia. It's the modern version of the drug, which has replaced old versions like SP and chloroquine is an old version to which there's more resistance. And IRS is indoor residual spraying, which basically means you spray the house once or twice a year at the walls to just provide another layer of protection to prevent transmission. AIDS has been one of the most dramatic, practical breakthroughs in the past 10 years since the Millennium Development Goals were set. You had, at the beginning of the decade, basically no one in Africa on antiretroviral treatment while the pandemic was raging. And there were roughly 10,000 people, most of them in South Africa, who were on treatment, while probably 2 million people and more were dying every year of the disease. And it was just ravaging societies. At the time, it was deemed impossible to treat, too hard, too difficult, too many complicated drug regimens. And now, thankfully, we're well over a few million people getting treated. And actually, the latest data that came out say that 5 million people worldwide in developing countries are on treatment. It's a major breakthrough backed by very practical measures of literally getting drugs to people who need them when they need them. Maternal mortality, if someone dies from in childbirth, although there's a lot of reasons why they might die after childbirth, you have simple interventions. On the left here is a classic ambulance in a low-income setting. Might be a bicycle if there is one, maybe a wheelbarrow is very common. On the right is literally an ambulance and a surgical theater, which is what it means to get a woman a C-section, for example, or emergency obstetrical care when she's in a delivery stage. It's very practical. There are many issues of enrollment, where we've seen breakthroughs. On the left is a classic schoolhouse in Nigeria, northern Nigeria. That's a photo taken from the Millennium Villages Project before it started. On the right is a school meals system, which has been initiated throughout the same project. And where you have abolition of school fees and very basic interventions like school meals, you actually see enrollments jump, sometimes 20, 30% overnight. So if we take stock of these points, we realize there are breakthroughs that have happened in some ways right beneath our eyes, in other ways actually because there's a large global community participating to problem solving, or participating in and contributing to problem solving. So I think it's worth just taking a moment to think about what have been some of those breakthroughs on a system basis, and what do we learn from them? And this is a key set of ideas, I think, for our entire course and our entire set of thought processes around integrated approaches to development practice. Measles control is a great, great global success story of the past decade. Basically, in 2000, targets were set internationally to cut measles deaths by 90% by 2010. In sub-Saharan Africa, that goal was met actually by 2007. And more than 1,000 lives a day have been saved in sub-Saharan Africa due to a major measles campaign, basically immunizations. Huge breakthrough, huge human benefit, and very much a quiet success that's happened under our eyes globally. And not just in Africa, but around the rest of the world. And here you see in this graph on the blue side where the world was in 2000, and on the red side where it is in 2008. This is a graph on antiretroviral treatment in Africa alone. You see that in 2002, this was basically no one on antiretroviral treatment. Almost impossible to believe today that that was the case, given how far we've all come. You see a major takeoff, and this only covers through to 2008. In 2009, the latest data, which have been tentatively shared internationally, show that in 2009, an extra 1 million people alone got access to treatment compared to 2008 globally. Went from 4 million to 5 million. Most of the growth is in sub-Saharan Africa still. It's an extraordinary breakthrough of the global community. In food production, we showed that slide of the scrawny bit of maize and a big bit of maize, corn stalk. We've actually had a country, Malawi, double its food production. This is a graph taken from a paper that Glenn Denning and colleagues wrote, looking at Malawi's food production. The black line is how much food they were producing. The white line is how much they needed to feed themselves every year. And basically, you have this up and down seesaw story of, I wouldn't quite say feast and famine, but certainly famine after famine, every time the rains failed in particular, every time there was a crisis. And after yet another crisis in 2005, the president said, I'm going to make sure all of my farmers get fertilizer and modern seeds. And literally since then, the country's doubled food production and became a food aid giver to its neighbors during the food crisis of 2008. Extraordinarily practical, extraordinarily simple intervention that's changed the economic and development course of that country. Even on income poverty, you have a country like Ghana, which in 1992 had half of its population living on less than $1 a day. Today it's down to nearly a quarter, about 28% living on less than $1 a day. It's an extraordinary breakthrough in one country, and still progressing since 2006. In Tanzania, at a country scale, you had roughly half or 50% net primary school enrollment rates at the beginning of the decade, and now you're actually up to almost 100% already, just within a decade. It's an extraordinary change for a country that has had very sustained long-term challenge and a hurdle to cross in terms of building its education system. And there are a few key elements of success that go across all of these. And I show this cross-section of examples just to show there are country successes, there are global successes, they're in all sorts of different areas, and we have to unpack them to understand them. The Millennium Development Goals give us a very good framework for measuring success, but the issues and the lessons are much deeper than the Millennium Development Goals. They're about progress in tackling the challenges of sustainable development. So all of these have clear performance targets. What were they trying to achieve? Universal access to medicine, ending malaria deaths, every sleeping site under a bed net, going from 1 ton per hectare to 3 tons per hectare, immunizing every child. Very explicit delivery targets, crucially with a known technology. So we weren't guessing at what antiretrovirals were to treat AIDS patients. Antiretrovirals existed, bed nets existed, immunizations existed, fertilizer and seeds existed. Really focusing on delivery targets using known technologies is really important. Crucially, and we'll come back to this a lot more, each of these had adequate finance. None of these things were done for free. Typically, the gate opener, or the floodgate opener, was that practical plans finally got financial resources to be implemented. So there's some misunderstanding around the role of money in a lot of these conversations. No one ever should suggest throwing money at a problem, but most basic solutions need money. And like anything in life, you need to put proper resources into solving real challenges, and each of these has its own story around that. Each of them actually has a global mechanism now for achieving scale, where it's gone from small scale to big scale. That might be the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, Malaria. That might be the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. That might be the new Smallholder Trust Fund, the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program at the World Bank. Each of them has a crucial mechanism to taking it from concept to scale. They all have very clear audit and accounting systems to track where things are going well and where they're going not, and to have a monitoring and evaluation mechanism for what success is and is not happening. And importantly, they all have clear leadership. And really importantly, in some cases it's the government sector, in some cases it's the government working with the private sector, in some cases it's academics working with the government and the private sector. But there's a cross-section of leaders who are actually taking on the responsibility to try and help solve real problems. So just to conclude for a moment, or nearly conclude on the question of cost. Now, one of the big challenges I think we face as a global society is the fact that, by definition, extremely poor people have no money. And for them to do things that cost money, they need support. So there are some things for which people can make money, and you want to give them a loan or give them a chance to pay it back over time. There are many things that they'll never be able to pay back. So as a general rule, poor people with no money cannot pay back a bed net. And the world tried for many years to sell bed nets, and not surprisingly, not many people bought them because they couldn't afford them. And they can't really pay back anytime soon the school fees that are outside of their reach. And that's why when school fees of $8 or $10 per child per year were cut in places like Malawi and Tanzania and Kenya, literally millions of children showed up overnight because the families couldn't afford $8. And putting your child through grade 4 doesn't make you a lot of money soon. And your child finishing primary school or high school might be essential for them being able to earn an income over a lifetime, but the parents can't pay it anytime soon. And that's the essence of public investment, is that we need to make big investments in the basic issues where people can't make a dollar, education, health, infrastructure, but where there's huge value to the investment over time. A healthy, productive, well-educated, well-connected, market-based society. And so through the UN Millennium Project, we actually said for all the things, we went through this over the case of a couple of years, for all the things that need very practical investments, where basically the government or the international community of governments needs to support, what would it cost? And this is the result of that study, which said over 10 years, what would it cost? And this is in the readings, so I won't get into it in detail here. But if you look at the numbers across the bottom row, it showed that basically you're looking at around $100 to $110 per person per year. This is actually currencies from several years ago, so probably it's closer to $150 per year today in 2010 dollars. That's for the blend of education, health, infrastructure, agriculture costs, and so forth, that the poorest people can't pay for on their own. It's a very small amount of money for a total set of services to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. It only happens to be a lot of money if you have none, or if your household income in cash might be $40 a year, which is not uncommon in the poorest parts of the world. Or if your national income per capita is $300 a year, this is totally unaffordable on a national, economy-wide basis. And that's where foreign aid comes in. And we're going to come back to that topic later in the semester. But just to give a teaser on the logic of starting with the needs, figuring out the financing, and figuring out how much can be paid for locally, and then how much needs to be supported externally if you want to achieve a basic set of goals. And so this is a quick graph of applying that logic to Ghana, where you have three types of financing. You have the households, you have the national government, and you have the foreign aid. And you might have many scenarios, or this is a projection from a few years ago, it might need to be updated today, where each will go at its own pace. And the idea, of course, is that over time, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or a generation, depending on the situation, the foreign aid can be phased out so that the government expenditures and the household expenditures are paying for everything. But depending on how poor the starting point is, that might be a long time in some countries. That gives us a quick jump to global finance. This is where the world is in its official development assistance. That's the technical term for foreign aid globally as of 2009. And this is how much countries are giving as a share of national income. There are 5 countries that have already met the international target that's been agreed upon as 0.7% of national income. This is the club of rich countries. At the far right, Korea just joined the official OECD club of rich countries in 2009. It's basically the first country to make the leap from aid recipient country to aid giving country within the course of a little more than a generation, and a huge success story. So it looks a little bit worse than it is. It's actually kind of top of the list given how far they've come, but it's on the far right here as a share of income because they're just starting in a big way to give foreign support. But the red line, the dotted line, shows the estimate that we made in the UN Millennium Project of roughly how much it would cost to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. If you actually take that rough $110 per capita number and scale it around the world, it's actually totally affordable at about half of 1% of gross national product of the rich countries. So these Millennium Goals are actually affordable within what's been promised. The problem is that if you take an average of where the world is right now, it's actually closer to 0.3%. And between, depending on the year, 0.3 and 0.4% of national income on the global basis. So we actually have not put enough financing into the global system to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. It's still in the range of some things can't be done without more money, but it's all actually feasible within what's been promised. And that's a really important concept for underscoring the notion of how the goals can be achieved. Now, finally, I think it's important that we think about, I'll just mention these briefly and we get into it in our local discussion, what are some of the critiques of the Millennium Goals? Because there are people who think this isn't a great idea. There are people who think they don't like certain pieces of the ideas. And so this just flags what I would classify as a few types. There's one set that says this is, or has said, and it's changed over time, this is a top-down approach, it's one size fits all. And there's another which says this is just the UN bureaucrats coming up with goals, central planning for the world from the United Nations headquarters. There's another which says it overlooks key priorities. 8 goals is great, but what about everything that's not in there? What about human rights? What about governance? What about reproductive health? What about other issues that we're skipping? There's another which says this doesn't focus enough on inequalities domestically. So how can you look at averages when there's so much variation in so many countries, so many people are left out? And then there's another which is that, it's too expensive. We're in a global economic crisis. Don't ask for more money, please. We've just spent a couple $1 trillion on bailing out our own economies. How could we spend, a few tens of millions extra on the poorest countries? How does that work? So I'll just say very quickly, and I hope that this discussion is laid out. I, of course, don't agree with any of these in a deep way, because I think each of them actually doesn't quite capture the essence of what the goals are and what they are not. But I think it's an important thing to flag and to discuss. Why is that? Because I'll let you make up your own minds of what you think about that. The goals as common outcomes give a lot of space for each country to take its own path and to achieve its own success. And it's actually pretty impossible to do a top-down approach globally on anything these days. But what it does do is actually gives a shared set of reference points for what success looks like. I think that's very important for, as Bill Gates said, keeping a common scorecard of what we're trying to do. And actually, because different countries have such different starting points, the things that they need to do to make their proportionate gains are so different. And it's actually just not even technically right to try and think of this as one size fits all. In terms of the views of UN bureaucrats or central planning, well, maybe someone would say I was one of those. But I think that the goals, and it's why it's so important to stress that the initial set of goals were set by world leaders. The world leaders set these goals. The UN was just given the task to carry much of it forward. But in truth, my view is the world's goals are led by communities, countries, organizations, and enterprises that take them on. And so they're a very nice accountability structure for us to think through who's taking responsibility and who's not for solving very practical problems. And the reality is that there's a complex network of financing, power, and governance structures throughout the world, and there's no single institution that drives any of this. There's sets of institutions that work on each problem, locally, at a community level, nationally at a government level, and internationally at a system level. And the system that works on global health is very different than the system that works on global agriculture, is very different than the system that hasn't even been set up to work on water around the world. And each professional community actually works in its own way and has a very different set of dynamics. And ultimately, many of them are run by finance ministries who pay the bills. And that's a deep issue in the world. In terms of overlooking key priorities, the goals are very useful in flagging a lot of issues. They're the kind of best scorecard we have. They're not exhaustive. They don't address issues like infrastructure. They don't address, at the outset, they didn't address reproductive health. Now they do. A target was added for that. And these need to be seen as, I would say, a reference point, but not a complete one. And in effect, the best one the world has set for itself. So where they have limitations, that shouldn't be seen as inherently a downside of the goals. It should be seen as, wow, even when we have something this coherent, there's more to be done, and we have to make sure we never lose sight of that. On the inequalities, I think that there are two general issues. One is that, by definition, the goals are focusing on global inequality and the most extreme forms of inequality. The other is that any national strategy should similarly be focusing on those who are most left out, because that's where the most dramatic gains are to be made in achieving the goals. And we have to be careful not to get stuck in any averages, and we have to be, I think, very committed to carrying the spirit of the goals, to making sure that the ultimate ambition of this is for the have-nots. And then finally, on the too expensive. I think that this is one of the most dramatic misunderstandings of our time. And this is where we have a real responsibility in all walks of life to understand this and explain this to people around us. We are talking about 0.5% of national income to tackle the problems of the poorest and most marginalized people on the planet. 1 billion people for less than 0.5% of the rich country's national income could receive basic services to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. It's an extraordinary thought that it's not even 1%, it's half of 1%. And we have an extraordinary capacity right now in the richest countries to spend 5 and 10% at a time of our national income on emergency measures that are of sometimes questionable value, sometimes really important value. But for some reason, we haven't yet figured out systematically how to make sure we put just the smallest share of resources to the deepest of global problems. And that's part of what this effort is all about, is saying, how do we solve those problems together? It's not just financial resources, it's intellectual resources, it's conceptual resources, it's institutional resources, and more than anything, it's kind of human ingenuity and adrenaline that will get us there. So with that said, let me thank you and look forward to a good discussion now.